start, it is attributed to Albert Einstein, but then again, at the same time, it is questionable whether this is a true story or if it's just a story to make a point. So I'll leave it at that. I'm not saying that that it definitely happened the way that this says. But a university professor at a well-known institution of higher learning challenged his students with this question: did God create everything that exists? A student bravely replied, yes, he did. God created everything, the professor asked. Yes, sir, he certainly did, the student replied. The professor answered, if God created everything, then God created evil. And since evil exists, and according to the principle that our works define who we are, then we can assume God is evil. The student became quiet and did not respond to the professor's hypothetical definition. The professor, quite pleased with himself, boasted to the students that he had proven once more that the Christian faith was a myth. Another student raised his hand and said, may I ask you a question, Professor? Of course, replied the professor. And the student stood up and asked, Professor, does cold exist? What kind of question is this? Of course it exists. Have you never been cold? The other student snickered at the young man's question. But the young man replied, in fact, sir, cold does not exist. According to the laws of physics, what we consider cold is in reality the absence of heat. Everybody or object is susceptible to study when it has or transmits energy. And heat is what makes a body or matter have or transmit energy. Absolute zero, which is negative 460 degrees Fahrenheit, is the total absence of heat. And all matter becomes inert and incapable of reaction at that temperature. Cold does not exist. We have created this word to describe how we feel when we have no heat. The student continued, Professor, does darkness exist? The professor responded, of course it does. The student replied, once again, you are wrong, sir. Darkness does not exist either. Darkness is in reality the absence of light. Light we can study, but darkness we can't. In fact, we can use Newton's prism to break white light into many colors and study the various wavelengths of each color. But you cannot measure darkness. A simple ray of light can break into a world of darkness and illuminate it. How can you know how dark a certain space is? You measure the amount of light present. Isn't that correct? Darkness is a term used by man to describe what happens when there is no light present. Finally, the young man asked the professor, sir, does evil exist? Now uncertain, the professor responded, of course, as I've already said, we see it every day. It is the daily examples of man's inhumanity to man. It is in the multitude of crime and violence everywhere in the world. To this, the student replied, evil does not exist, sir, or at least it does not exist unto itself. Evil is simply the absence of God. It is just like the darkness and cold, a word that man has created to describe the absence of God. God did not create evil. Evil is the result of what happens when man does not have God's love present in his heart. It's like the cold that comes when there is no heat, or the darkness that comes when there is no light. The professor sat down. Like I said, the story goes that the young man's name was Albert Einstein. Now, whether he actually had that interaction or not, I don't know. But it makes the point. What we call evil is just the absence of God. Imagine with me for a moment that you're standing in a cave. Maybe down in Carlsbad where we were at a few years ago, or a cave here in this area, and they turn off all the lights and you're in total darkness. Can't even see your hand in front of your face. Has anybody ever experienced that? I've got to do it a few times. It's kind of eerie. But all it takes is one little light to break into that darkness. You may not be able to see everything clearly right away, But that darkness starts to fade away as soon as one light comes in. Now imagine that you have a kid or a teenager or even an adult with you that is completely terrified of the dark, or maybe that's you. I saw a couple of people shaking their head when I asked you to imagine that complete darkness. Darkness freaks people out sometimes. But all it takes is that one little light to break in that starts to move the darkness out. I know when we're at home, when Kelly and I like to watch TV in the evenings, we might have a lamp on in the room, but we like it pretty dark so we can see the TV better, so that the light of the TV shines brighter, so we can see better. Like I said, normally we'll keep a lamp on, especially now that we have Neeland, our dog, who's black. If we don't have a little light on, he can sneak up on us pretty easy. But one of my favorite places to be, go ahead and put that next slide up, Dave. One of my favorite places to be on earth is Neyland Stadium. That's where Tennessee plays their home football games. I know. I can see back there. So. But that's fine. It'll come up in just a minute. That's one of my favorite places to be, but it's even better at night when they play under the lights. Now, for you, it may be OU Stadium, it may be OSU Stadium, it may be something else. That's fine. Tennessee's where I'm from, so it will always be one of my favorite places. But there's just something about being there at night, playing under the lights. And there's one thing that's common in all of those scenarios: the cave, watching TV at night, playing under the lights. It's the light. There's one thing in common. Light shows us what is happening. Or in the case of complete darkness, the absence of light, we don't know what's going on around us. But again, that light breaking in, light illuminates what is around us. And in the sense of a stadium, you can see those lights from miles and miles away. I think of it this way: you're driving into a city that you've never been in before, and you see lights on the horizon. You know that there's some kind of stadium or some kind of something there. It draws your attention. You're driving into New York City at night and you see the skyline for the first time. Or I've been told about driving into Las Vegas, that it's just out in the middle of the desert and then all of a sudden you see the skyline just lit up. You know where that is. You know at least the direction that you need to go because the light illuminates what is around you. You can see the lights on the horizon before you get anywhere close. You might not even know where the stadium is, but you can see the light. I know this past football season, high school season, when we went to a lot of the games away from here, there were cities that we hadn't been to yet, that we hadn't visited yet. And we, most of the time, found the high school stadium by looking for the lights. I know we found some basketball games that way too. We knew the school would be near where the football stadium lights were. Those lights draw us to them. And that's the backdrop. That's the backdrop of this next I am statement that we're talking about from Jesus. Go ahead and put the next slide up, Dave. Let me set the scene for you. Jesus is at what's called the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Tents, in Jerusalem. And this took place in the temple courts of the women, where there were a bunch of treasury. That's where people put their offerings, the court of the women. And in this court, there was a lot of open space, there was a lot of colonnades, there was a lot of places where you could stand and teach. And because this was one of the most traveled parts of the temple, it was easy to draw a crowd. And that's where Jesus is at with the light of the Feast of Tabernacles. One of the things that happened at the Feast of Tabernacles the first night, as it got dark, everything in Jerusalem got dark, they brought out 4 candelabras, huge candelabras, the 7 or 8 candles per candlestick. And these 4 candelabras that they set up in the court of women illuminated the entire temple. It is actually said that you could see these for miles around Jerusalem. They were that big. And it is in that scenario, it is in that backdrop that we find Jesus' I am statement that we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to look at John 8, starting in verse 12. We're going to look at 12 through 20 to begin with, and then we'll move on to some of it after that. But again, that is the backdrop, with the candelabras of the temple lit and Jerusalem aglow from that. And it says, Jesus spoke to them again, I am the light of the world. Anyone who follows me will never walk in the darkness, but will have the light of life. So the Pharisees said to him, you are testifying about yourself. Your testimony is not valid. Even if I testify about myself, Jesus replied, my testimony is true because I know where I came from and where I'm going. But you do not know where I came from or where I come from or where I'm going. You judge by human standards. I judge no one. And if I do judge, my judgment is true because it is not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me. Even in your law it is written that the testimony of two witnesses is true. I am the one who testifies about myself, and my Father who sent me testifies about me. And then they asked him, where is your Father? You know neither me nor my Father, Jesus answered. If you knew me, you would also know my Father. He spoke these words by the treasury while teaching in the temple, but no one seized him because his hour had not yet come. So he's standing there, he says, I'm the light of the world. And no one who follows me will ever walk in darkness. And the Pharisees argue with him. They make the Jewish claim that it can't be true unless it's more than two or more than one witness verifies it. And Jesus says, well, that's even with that, I testify about it and the Father backs it up. The Father gives testimony to that as well. Then Jesus goes on in verses 21 through 47 that we're not going to read. He goes on and predicts His crucifixion and His return. He also tells them if you continue in my word, you really are my disciples. You will know the truth. The truth will set you free. He's telling them that he is a descendant of Abraham, and basically makes the claim in this that he is greater than Abraham. And then we come to verse 48 through 59. It says, the Jews responded to him, aren't we right in saying that you're a Samaritan and have a demon? So they're trying to basically devalue what Jesus is saying. They're claiming that he's a Samaritan, which the Jews don't like, and that he is demon-possessed. Jesus responds. He says, I do not have a demon, Jesus answered. On the contrary, I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it and judges. Truly I tell you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. And then the Jews said, now we know you have a demon. Abraham died, and so did the prophets. You say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died, and the prophets died? Who do you claim to be? Jesus responded. He says, if I glorify myself, Jesus answered, my glory is nothing. My Father, about whom you say he is our God, he is the one who glorifies me. You do not know him, but I know him. If I were to say I don't know him, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. And the Jews replied, you aren't 50 years old yet, and you've seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus was hidden and went out of the temple. This is a direct claim, just like all of the I am statements that we're looking at. This is Jesus directly claiming that he is the Son of God, that he is the Messiah, that he is equal to God, and the Jews do not like what he had to say there. They're ready to kill him because he is making that direct claim. I am was what name God gave to Moses to tell to the other Israelites. And here is Jesus saying, before Abraham was, I am. And the Jews were not ready to hear that. Just imagine that all of this is taking place in the temple, all aglow with the lights of those candelabras that I described earlier. It had to be a magnificent sight to behold. I mean, I just can't imagine how beautiful that must have been. Like the skyline of New York City or the skyline of Las Vegas or whatever city you like to see. I love to see the skyline of Cincinnati, where I went to school. I love to see the skyline of Oklahoma City or those lights of Neyland Stadium. Modern day sights to see. Yet here's Jesus saying, okay, this may be impressive, this may be beautiful, you love seeing the temple all lit up, it's spectacular, but I'm the light of the world. I illuminate what God the Father has brought about. I draw people to God. If you know me, you know my Father. I light the way to the Father. And John, who we're reading his gospel here, he uses this imagery throughout the book of John. In fact, we find it in the very beginning in what I consider my favorite birth narrative. John 1 through 13. John writes this. He says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through Him. And apart from Him, not one thing was created that has been created. In Him was life, and that life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, and yet the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was created through him, and yet the world did not recognize him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, he gave them the right to be children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of natural descent, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God." See, John lays it out for us right from the beginning, that Jesus is the light of the world. And that through the light of the world we come to know God. The world's a dark place. Spiritually speaking, the world is a very dark place at times. It's almost like that complete darkness that you see in a cave. But Jesus gives us the light. Jesus is the light of the world. Without Jesus, we cannot see past that darkness. Just like when you're in the cave in total darkness. But we've talked a lot recently about the idea of how this world is dying. We see people leaving this life every day without knowing Jesus, without the light of Jesus in their life. But here's the thing, we know the light. We get to experience the light. We have the light because of our acceptance and our relationship with Jesus. So I ask, how can we sit by and not share the light with those that need it as much as we do? In one of the other Gospels, Jesus says, a city on a hill cannot be hidden. In other words, the light of a city from a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do you light a lamp and put a bowl over it to cover the lamp or to cover the light and let it not escape. If we know the light, if we follow Jesus and we know Him as the light of the world, we have to be shining that light to other people. We have to be allowing other people to see His work in us and introducing them to the light of the world. Now, next week, we're actually going to double up on the light of the world because He says it again in chapter 9. So go ahead and read John 9 next week before you come next week. We're going to be talking a little more in depth about what He's claiming to be as the light of the world. But for now, if you haven't accepted Him as the light of the world, if you haven't accepted Him as your Savior, now's a great time to do so. Any decision you need to make this morning, now's the time to do it as we stand and sing, "Open My Eyes That I May See." Number 563, we're going to sing all verses.